A revolution declares the rights of man in AD 1789, sends thousands to death in the name of public safety in AD 1793 and AD 1794, is seized by Bonaparte in 18 Brumaire in AD 1799, and by AD 1804 stands beneath an imperial crown. That is not a tidy march of progress. That is the French Revolution, and it remains one of history's most unsettling riddles. I'm Professor Adrian Lockewell. And the enduring power of this story lies in a contradiction too large to ignore. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen spoke in the language of universal dignity, legal equality, and political legitimacy grounded not in dynastic accident, but in the nation. Yet within a single decade, that same revolution would produce emergency tribunals, ideological purges, mass mobilization, military glory, and finally a new monarchy in everything but name. The chronology is brief. The transformation is immense. This is why the familiar versions of the French Revolution are too small for the reality. One version presents a glorious emancipation briefly stained by excess, as if terror and empire were unfortunate detours from an otherwise pure road. The other dismisses the entire upheaval as fraud from the beginning, as if rights were merely decorative language draped over raw ambition. Both interpretations are comfortable. Both fail. The French Revolution was neither simple redemption nor simple deception. It was a collapse of legitimacy so profound that every organized faction capable of mastering language, institutions, propaganda, and force could claim, for a moment, to speak in the name of all France. That is where the famous formula enters the story with its true weight. Liberty, equality, fraternity was not handed down at the first instant as a fixed and universally obeyed command. Its authority grew across struggle, improvisation, and political necessity. But even before it acquired official force, its strategic value was already enormous. Such language does not merely inspire. It recruits. It gives moral elevation to political programs, turns grievance into mission. It allows particular interests to appear as universal justice. And that is why revolutionary language travels so far and so fast. It does not speak only to reason. It binds morality, identity, and belonging into a single weapon. The words themselves carried genuine promise. Liberty could mean protection against arbitrary power. Equality could mean the destruction of legal privilege. Fraternity could mean a civic bond wide enough to replace inherited hierarchy. None of that was trivial. None of it was fake. Yet history becomes dangerous when principles remain noble while their political uses expand. Under pressure, liberty can harden into the demand to silence enemies of liberty. Equality can shift from equal rights into enforced sameness. Fraternity can become a test of ideological loyalty in which dissent appears as betrayal. Principle does not always vanish when power seizes it. Sometimes principle becomes more powerful precisely because power learns how to speak through it. That is the deeper puzzle. The revolution shattered hereditary privilege, weakened the moral foundations of divine right monarchy, and gave modern politics a vocabulary no serious regime could ever fully ignore again. At the same time, it revealed something darker and more enduring. Universal ideals possess exceptional strategic force because they let organized minorities channel mass emotion without appearing narrow or selfish. Crowds bring energy. Institutions preserve gains. Print, rumor, and rhetoric coordinate belief. Force settles conflicts when words alone cannot. The decisive actors were rarely those with the purest intentions. They were often those most capable of converting moral language into governing machinery. So this cannot be reduced to a mob in the streets, though the streets mattered greatly. Nor can it be reduced to a hidden cabal, though clubs, newspapers, committees, and ambitious men were indispensable to what followed. The revolution was a crisis in sovereignty itself. The monarchy lost its monopoly on legitimacy, and the vacuum drew in successive claimants to national authority. Moderates, constitutional monarchists, Jacobins, journalists, municipal activists, provincial insurgents, soldiers, committeemen, and finally a general of extraordinary discipline all insisted that they embodied the nation. None could govern by violence alone. None could endure by sentiment alone. The factions that prevailed, even if briefly, were usually those that fused conviction with organization and administrative reach with moral certainty. That is why the ideals of AD 1789 were never irrelevant to the terror of AD 1793, the coup of AD 1799, or the coronation of AD 1804. They were connected not because liberty inevitably produces dictatorship, nor because rights were always a cynical mask, but because once sovereignty is transferred from the king's body to the nation's name, the central struggle becomes brutally clear. Who has the power to define the nation, to defend it, to purify it, and to rule through it? The French Revolution matters because it remade the political imagination of the modern world. But the real question is not whether it mattered. The real question is what it accomplished, for whom, and at what cost. Who was emancipated? Who was crushed? Who learned to govern in the language of emancipation itself? And before that language swept across Europe, before slogans became banners and banners became armies, France was already a great power trapped inside a fiscal crisis, a society of privilege, and a monarchy too weak to reform the order that sustained it. Before pamphlets began to speak in the name of mankind, the French monarchy was already trapped by a more immediate master, arithmetic. Bourbon France entered AD 1789 not as a dying relic, but as one of Europe's great powers. Populous, cultured, militarily formidable, and still capable of projecting influence across the continent and beyond. That strength concealed the regime's fatal contradiction. A state ambitious enough to compete with Britain and intervene in global wars still depended on a fiscal order shaped by privilege, exemption, and negotiated obedience. France was not collapsing because it was frozen in the medieval past. It was collapsing because it was an unfinished hybrid, modern in ambition, pre-modern in extraction, and increasingly unable to force the two into alignment. The numbers had been warning the crown for decades. The 7 Years' War had inflicted a heavy financial wound and exposed strategic weakness against Britain. Then the monarchy chose to re-enter the imperial contest through support for the American War of Independence. That decision had logic. It weakened a rival, avenged earlier defeats, and restored some prestige. But prestige purchased on credit is one of history's most expensive luxuries. France helped humble Britain abroad while deepening insolvency at home. Debt service consumed larger portions of state revenue. Loans accumulated because loans were easier than structural reform. The monarchy was borrowing against a future it no longer possessed the political authority to organize. The crisis did not rest simply on the size of the debt. Great powers can survive debt when they can tax efficiently, centralize authority, and compel sacrifice from those with wealth. The Bourbon monarchy struggled to do any of the three. Much of the nobility and clergy remained shielded by major exemptions from direct taxation. Tax farming diverted collection through private interests that profited from inefficiency. Venal office turned parts of the state into property that could be bought, sold, inherited, and defended against reform. Jurisdictions overlapped. Privileges multiplied. Local custom resisted uniformity. From a distance, the monarchy appeared majestic. Up close, it looked like a machine assembled from exceptions. That is why the careers of Turgot, Necker, Calonne, and Brienne matter. They were not architects of revolution. They were ministers attempting to save a regime from its own design. Turgot understood that privilege had to be pruned and economic life partially liberalized if the state hoped to regain flexibility. He was dismissed. Necker relied more heavily on credit, confidence, and public reputation, buying time without solving the underlying problem. Calonne confronted the issue most directly. If the monarchy was to remain a great power, the privileged orders would have to contribute more like a nation and less like a protected caste. Brienne inherited the same impasse and discovered what all reforming ministers in structurally weak regimes eventually discover. Everyone praises reform in principle until reform presents the bill. Different personalities, same verdict. The state needed revenue, but privilege retained enough power to veto the means of obtaining it. The Assembly of Notables in AD 1787 made that contradiction visible. Calonne expected a hand-picked elite to endorse sweeping fiscal changes and lend them legitimacy. Instead, the notables questioned the crown's proposals, demanded fuller accounting, and resisted the sacrifice required of their own order. The monarchy had summoned the kingdom's most eminent men to stabilize the system. They answered by proving that the system could no longer discipline its own beneficiaries. This was the old regime in concentrated form. Reform was necessary, indispensable even so long as it burdened someone else. The resistance of the parliaments in AD 1787 and AD 1788 widened the crisis from solvency into sovereignty. These were not democratic institutions. They were high courts dominated by privileged magistrates with their own corporate interests. Yet by refusing to register new fiscal measures and presenting themselves as guardians of the kingdom's laws, they managed to cloak obstruction in constitutional language. One of history's recurring patterns emerged with startling clarity. Entrenched elites often defend advantages by speaking as if they are defending liberty itself. The crown, in search of money, appeared arbitrary. The defenders of exemption, in search of self-preservation, appeared principled. Once that inversion settled into public life, royal authority was no longer merely strained. It was discredited. Then material hardship intensified political fragility. Poor harvests in AD 1788, followed by grain price instability in AD 1788 and AD 1789, injected social fear into an already brittle order. Bread in 18th century France was not a minor commodity. It was the central line in the budget of ordinary survival. When prices rose sharply, abstraction lost its force. Hunger does not invent revolutions on its own, but it destroys patience, magnifies rumor, and makes every failure of government feel immediate and personal. In the countryside, anxiety spread through fragile households. In the towns, wage earners watched subsistence slip beyond reach. A fiscal crisis at the summit was becoming a crisis of endurance below. So the crown turned to an ancient instrument that it believed could restore confidence. The Estates General, convened in AD 1789 for the first time since 1614. In theory, it was a controlled mechanism for authorizing revenue. In practice, it was a confession that ordinary government had failed. The monarchy did not intend to unleash a social revolution. It sought managed reform, renewed credit, and obedience with broader consent. But once representation was summoned, the question could no longer be contained within taxation. Who had the right to speak for France? The king had asked the nation for money. He was about to discover that others would answer by claiming the nation itself. Fiscal collapse had opened the chamber. Print, rumor, and political audacity now transformed that chamber into something far more dangerous. A contest over who had the right to define France itself. Under the old order, the kingdom was imagined as a hierarchy of estates, privileges, and inherited functions gathered beneath the crown. In AD 1789, that picture began to disintegrate. A new claim entered the arena with explosive force. The nation existed before privilege, and those who worked, produced, paid, and served constituted its real substance. No text struck that claim more cleanly than Abbé Sieyes' What is the Third Estate? In AD 1789, its brilliance was not ornament but compression. The Third Estate, Sieyes declared, was everything. In the political order, it had been nothing. It now demanded to become something. That was more than a complaint. It was a transfer of sovereignty. Legitimacy was pulled away from inherited rank and relocated into productive society. Nobility, long presented as the natural leadership of the realm, could now be recast as an exception living upon the labor of others. In a few pages, social resentment acquired constitutional language. The leap from argument to action came with astonishing speed. The deputies of the Third Estate, joined by some clergy and a smaller number of nobles, declared themselves the National Assembly in AD 1789. Law had not authorized this transformation. That was precisely the point. It was one of those decisive revolutionary moments when language outruns legality and, by outrunning it, begins to replace it. The tennis court oath that followed was not empty theater. It announced that political authority could continue without royal permission because its source had moved. The king had summoned orders to solve a fiscal crisis. The deputies answered by inventing the nation as a sovereign actor. Then Paris imposed its own verdict. The storming of the Bastille in AD 1789 mattered less for military utility than for symbolic command. The fortress was not strategically decisive in the conventional sense. Its true value was political demonstration. A crowd in the capital had shown that force in Paris could alter the direction of national events. Legitimacy was no longer confined to decrees, ceremonies, or the formal language of ministers. It could be seized in the streets, magnified by print, and confirmed by rumor before the state could regain control. In revolutions, perception often outruns fact, and once that happens, those who can stage politics begin to overpower those who merely administer it. The countryside answered in a different but equally consequential register. During the Great Fear of AD 1789, reports of aristocratic conspiracy spread with astonishing speed across rural France. Peasants attacked manor houses, but even more revealing were the attacks on feudal records. That was not random destruction. It was an assault on the documentary machinery of domination. Feudal dues, customary burdens, and seigneurial claims lived not only in memory but in paper, archives, and legal proof. To burn those records was to strike at the enforceability of the old regime itself. The message reaching Paris was unmistakable. Privilege was no longer merely resented. It was becoming impossible to govern through. The famous night of AD August 4th, 1789 followed under the pressure of fear, calculation, and self-preservation. The August decrees did not simply express generosity from above. They reflected a ruling class recognizing that the social order beneath it was breaking apart. Key feudal privileges were dismantled, and concession was rapidly recast as principle. That pattern would become one of the revolution's enduring methods. Pressure from below, surrender above, then moral universalization in law. Soon after, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in AD 1789 gave the upheaval a vocabulary of immense range. Rights, liberty, equality, national sovereignty. These were ideals, certainly, but they were also instruments with extraordinary political reach. That reach came from strategic ambiguity. Equality could mean equality before the law. It could also mean the destruction of aristocratic precedents, the demand for civic uniformity, or the suspicion that any visible distinction concealed corruption. The same slogan could unite reformers, avengers, moralists, and centralizers beneath a single banner. That is why revolutionary language can move so quickly. Its force lies not in precision but in capacity. It recruits different hopes into the same camp long enough to change the balance of power. Around this new language emerged a new political class. Lawyers, journalists, office holders, intellectuals, and ambitious provincial professionals proved highly effective at speaking in the name of the nation. Not because all were hypocrites and not because all were pure, but because the new environment rewarded those who could turn grievance into representation and representation into organized pressure. The Jacobin Club, the Cordeliers, the incendiary journalism of Marat, the rhetoric of Desmoulins, and the proliferating political societies of AD 1789 created a pressure system outside formal government, capable of disciplining deputies, arousing crowds, and punishing hesitation. Public opinion, in the modern political sense, was being forged as a battlefield. The people became at once a moral source, a legitimizing language, and a strategic claim. Everyone invoked them. No faction could fully possess them. Yet those best able to print, organize, network, and intimidate could often appear to embody them. Birth had not vanished from politics, but it now faced a formidable rival: organizational skill. France had proclaimed a nation with breathtaking speed. Determining who could rule in that nation would prove far more difficult, and that unresolved struggle was moving steadily toward the king. By the end of AD 1789, the revolution had already performed its first great act of symbolic conquest. The October days did more than force bread into the political conversation and move the royal family from Versailles to Paris. They dragged monarchy into a new arena where distance, ceremony, and mystique could no longer protect it. Installed in the Tuileries and surrounded by the Assembly, the press, and the volatility of the capital, Louis XVI ceased to appear as the remote center of the kingdom and began to look like a prisoner of events. In a legitimacy crisis, that change is fatal. Power that cannot command often survives by projecting inevitability. Once that aura evaporates, every silence becomes suspicious and every hesitation becomes political evidence. France still might have stabilized under a constitutional monarchy. Many revolutionaries did not yet want a republic. They wanted a king who could lend continuity to a transformed state. That was the opening Louis XVI could never inhabit. He was not a theatrical tyrant and not a heroic resistor. He was something more dangerous to the survival of compromise, a monarch incapable of convincing the nation that he believed in the settlement placed before him. He signed decrees, accepted limits, and outwardly complied, yet his conduct carried the unmistakable scent of inward refusal. He seemed too weak to defeat the revolution and too insincere to preserve it. In moments of upheaval, that middle position does not calm politics, poisons it. The decisive fracture came through religion. The civil constitution of the clergy in AD 1790 looked, to many legislators, like rational statecraft. If sovereignty now resided in the nation, then the church inside France should be reorganized in national terms. Dioceses were redrawn, bishops and priests were turned into salaried public functionaries, and clergy were compelled to swear loyalty to the new order. Administratively, it promised clarity. Politically, it was explosive. The revolution had entered the sanctuary and demanded that conscience report to the state. That decision split the kingdom far beyond Paris. Priests who took the oath became constitutional clergy. Those who refused became refractory clergy, and with them came millions of believers who did not see resistance as aristocratic intrigue but as religious fidelity. Here the revolution committed one of its greatest strategic errors. It confused legal supremacy with moral authority. The assembly could confiscate church lands and redesign institutions, but it could not legislate conviction. Once sacred allegiance was forced into collision with political allegiance, opposition to the revolution gained a language deeper than policy. It became a struggle over obedience to God, memory, ritual, and the boundaries of legitimate power. A constitutional crisis was transformed into a war over the soul of the nation. Finance sharpened the damage. Assignats, backed by confiscated church property, were introduced as an emergency instrument to ease the crown's insolvency and keep the new regime functioning. In the short term, they helped unlock assets and buy time. In the long term, they fused money, expropriation, and revolutionary legitimacy into one unstable mechanism. Inflation and speculation followed, and ordinary people learned a hard lesson. The new order was not merely rewriting laws, it was remaking value itself. When a revolution turns sacred property into circulating paper, It announces that no institution stands outside political necessity. Then Louis XVI destroyed what remained of constructive ambiguity. The flight to Varennes in AD 1791 was not simply a failed escape. It was a confession in action. Until that moment, moderates could still pretend that the king was a reluctant but usable constitutional figure. Varennes ended that fiction. The man sworn to uphold the settlement had attempted to flee it. He did not need to declare war on the revolution in words. His movement did it for him. From that moment, suspicion became the most productive force in French politics. The Champ de Mars massacre in AD 1791 deepened the breach inside the revolutionary camp itself. When petitioners demanding the king's removal gathered and Lafayette's National Guard fired on the crowd, the coalition of AD 1789 fractured in full view. Patriots no longer disagreed only with royalists. They disagreed over the meaning of sovereignty, over whether legality should restrain popular pressure, and over whether order was preserving liberty or smothering it. Moderation began to look to radicals like disguised betrayal. Radicalism began to look to moderates like organized disorder. The Constitution of AD 1791 tried to freeze this instability into a durable framework. It created a limited monarchy, defined powers, and offered France the architecture of constitutional balance. But a constitution is not self-executing parchment. It requires actors willing to lose temporary advantage in order to preserve the system itself. France had the document and lacked the trust. The king possessed authority without credibility. The assembly possessed legality without cohesion. The public possessed expectations that no institutional formula could easily satisfy. That was the atmosphere in which the debate over war emerged. Brisset and his allies believed war could expose traitors, unite the nation, and carry revolutionary energy across Europe. Robespierre warned that war might strengthen the executive, elevate the army, normalize emergency rule, and hand the future to ambitious generals. Both arguments contained real strategic insight. Both underestimated how quickly foreign conflict would become a domestic instrument for measuring loyalty. Once trust collapsed at the center, war ceased to be a question of diplomacy alone. It became the furnace in which the revolution would decide who belonged, who was suspect, and who could be sacrificed. Spring AD 1792 changed the tempo of the revolution. Until then, France had been tearing itself apart over constitutions, vetoes, churches, and the limits of royal power. War converted those arguments into tests of survival. When France declared war on Austria in AD 1792, and Prussia soon entered the struggle, the political class was no longer arguing over the shape of a new order in relative safety. It was gambling that a divided country could fight like a unified nation. That gamble would redraw everything. The advocates of war, especially Brisset and his allies, believed conflict would expose hidden enemies, rally the nation, and carry revolutionary energy beyond France. Robespierre saw the darker possibility. War, he warned, could elevate generals, excuse repression, and teach governments to call every critic a traitor. The remarkable fact is that both readings contain the truth. War did not merely threaten the revolution from outside. It changed the internal incentives of power. Once armies marched, hesitation looked like sabotage, failure smelled of conspiracy, and politics became inseparable from suspicion. The early campaigns went badly enough to make paranoia plausible. France in AD 1792 was not yet a disciplined modern state. It was a revolution wearing the uniform of a nation before the nation itself had fully stabilized. Officers were suspect because many had aristocratic backgrounds. Volunteers were passionate but uneven. Command broke down. Retreats produced panic. In that atmosphere, military defeat was never just military defeat. It became moral evidence. A lost battle could be interpreted as treason. A delayed order could be read as collusion. And at the center of this expanding distrust stood Louis XVI, already compromised by the flight to Varennes, now increasingly imagined not as a constitutional monarch, but as a waiting ally of foreign intervention. Then came the Brunswick Manifesto in AD 1792, and with it one of the great self-inflicted disasters in the history of coalition warfare. Issued in the name of the Duke of Brunswick, it threatened Paris with destruction if the royal family were harmed. Its authors intended deterrence. They produced confirmation. In a political culture already saturated with fear, the manifesto seemed to announce what many had suspected all along. The crown and the invader were linked by a common interest. Foreign pressure did not cool the revolution. It fused patriotic alarm to revolutionary vengeance. The road from royal distrust to royal overthrow suddenly became very short. On August 10, AD 1792, that road ended at the Tuileries. The insurrection did more than topple a palace. It destroyed the practical viability of monarchy. The Swiss guards were cut down. The king sought refuge with the assembly, and the old fiction that Louis could still stand above factions collapsed under the weight of events. After August 10th, the monarchy survived briefly in form, but not in legitimacy. In revolutionary crises, institutions rarely die from argument alone. They die when enough actors conclude that obedience to them has become more dangerous than defiance. That threshold had been crossed. September made the psychology of siege unmistakable. As enemy forces advanced and rumors spread that prisoners inside Paris would rise in support of invasion, the capital descended into preemptive killing. The September massacres of AD 1792 were not an eruption of theory in pure form. They were the political logic of fear made physical. Once a city becomes convinced that enemies are everywhere, restraint starts to look irresponsible. Proof becomes secondary to prevention. The result was atrocity justified as necessity. This is one of the most enduring and terrible lessons of the revolution. Real danger can make monstrous behavior feel prudent. And yet the same month brought the military reprieve that saved the revolution from immediate collapse. At Valmy in AD 1792, French forces halted the Prussian advance. Tactically, it was not a vast annihilation. Strategically and psychologically, it was immense. Valmy gave the revolution what declarations and pamphlets never could. It gave it armed credibility. A regime that survives invasion gains a new authority because it has proved that it can command sacrifice, coordinate force, and endure under pressure. The victory electrified Europe. Goethe, present with the opposing forces, sensed that a new era had begun. He was witnessing not merely a battle, but the birth of a new political legitimacy forged in war. The convention proclaimed the Republic, and in AD 1793 Louis XVI was executed. The execution was more than punishment. It was a strategic declaration that the revolution would no longer share symbolic space with the old order. Once the king died, reconciliation with monarchic Europe became vastly harder, and the struggle assumed the character of a regime war. That decision was followed by converging emergencies. The first coalition pressed France from abroad. In the Vade in AD 1793, revolt exploded from the intersection of religion, monarchy, local loyalties, and fury at conscription. Federalist revolts challenged Paris from other regions. The Republic now faced enemies at the frontiers and enemies within its own administrative body. Under those conditions, legitimacy changed its currency. Constitutional balance no longer commanded the same prestige as effectiveness. The crucial question became brutally simple. Who could save the Republic? That is why surveillance committees spread, representatives on mission wielded extraordinary authority, and improvised intelligence networks began stitching governance to counter subversion. Reports, denunciations, emergency decrees, and local enforcement fused into a new machinery of rule. Liberty remained the official language. Unity became the operational command, and unity under siege increasingly meant obedience. From this point forward, the revolution would not be governed primarily by constitutional hope, but by the hardening logic of emergency. Pressure did not merely radicalize the Republic. It taught the men governing it to treat emergency as a form of normality. By AD 1793, invasion on the frontiers, rebellion in the provinces, inflation in the markets, and factional struggle in Paris had produced a political conclusion as old as crisis itself. Ordinary legality seemed too slow for survival. The Committee of Public Safety, created in AD 1793 as an emergency executive, became the instrument through which that conclusion was organized. Robespierre supplied its moral vocabulary, Saint-Just its severe political logic, Couthon helped sharpen its legislative edge, and Carnot directed war with relentless administrative purpose. This was not a descent into simple frenzy. It was government concentrating itself. The decisive innovation was coordination on a national scale. The levée en masse of AD 1793 revealed that the revolution had crossed from a struggle over sovereignty into a new kind of state power. War was no longer the business of dynasties maneuvering professional armies. France began to mobilize society itself. Young men were called to battle, older men to transport and production, women to manufacture, children to auxiliary labor, old men to public exhortation. The language was patriotic, but the mechanism was administrative. Households, workshops, roads, and local authorities were drawn into a single national effort. The Republic was learning that mass politics and mass mobilization strengthened each other. Under such conditions, neutrality became politically intolerable. The law of suspects, passed in AD 1793, widened the definition of the enemy beyond proven conspirators. It reached toward those whose conduct, speech, associations, or social identity suggested insufficient attachment to the revolution. That widening mattered more than any isolated arrest. It meant that danger was no longer something clearly located. It became a field of uncertainty spread across society. The Revolutionary Tribunal then transformed that uncertainty into procedure. Suspicion acquired forms, signatures, hearings, decrees, transport orders, and sentences. Violence was being rationalized. The guillotine entered memory as an emblem of bloodshed, but its deeper significance lay elsewhere. It represented punishment standardized, equalized, expedited, and wrapped in the language of civic necessity. Here the moral core of the terror becomes visible. Equality under siege could mutate into enforced sameness. Virtue ceased to be a personal aspiration and became a political credential controlled by those in office. Whoever defined virtue could also define betrayal. Robespierre's claim that terror was justice, prompt and inflexible, was not rhetorical excess alone. It expressed a governing doctrine in which moral purity and state violence were made to serve one another. The regime did not imagine itself as cynical. It believed that morality required the elimination of corruption, and that corruption could wear the face of hesitation, moderation, or doubt. In that belief, the revolution began to resemble something ominously modern, a state seeking not merely obedience but moral conformity. The terror also extended far beyond Paris. Memory often narrows the story to tribunals in the capital, yet the provinces reveal the scale of the system. In Lyon, after revolt against the convention, repression was pursued with extraordinary harshness to make an example of resistance. In Nantes, mass drownings exposed how delegated authority, once licensed by emergency, could produce cruelty that was both improvised and bureaucratic. In the Vendée, civil war merged religion, local loyalty, and counter-revolution into one of the most savage struggles of the decade. Republican retaliation there did not look like abstract philosophy. It looked like a state treating internal rebellion as contamination to be burned out of the body politic. The wider geography matters because it shows that terror was not simply a Parisian obsession. It was a national technology of discipline. Religion made the experiment still more unstable. Dechristianization campaigns attacked churches, symbols, calendars, and clergy with a fervor that tried to uproot old sacred authority altogether. Yet Robespierre distrusted pure atheistic radicalism. He understood that political orders do not live on negation alone. The cult of the supreme being was therefore not a bizarre side episode, but a revealing confession. A revolution that had shattered sacred monarchy still searched for civic transcendence, ritual, and moral elevation. Power had desacralized the old order, only to discover that it still needed a form of the sacred for itself. By AD 1794, the law of 22 Prairial tightened the machinery further, narrowing legal defense and accelerating executions. The distance between accusation and death grew shorter. Procedure remained, but its function was increasingly to speed judgment rather than test it. And yet the verdict on the terror cannot be reduced to spectacle or denunciation alone, because military fortunes improved in AD 1794. Victories helped stabilize the Republic and pushed back its enemies. That fact complicates the record. Coercion coincided with strategic recovery. But coincidence is not absolution. A regime may survive through methods that poison the very institutions it saves. Soon enough, that poison would move inward, and the republic that governed through fear would discover that fear recognizes no permanent masters. By the spring of AD 1794, the revolution had compressed political life into a suffocating narrowness. The Hébertists were executed in March, condemned as reckless extremists tied to dechristianization and popular militancy. Weeks later, the Dantonists followed, denounced not for restoring monarchy but for exhaustion, hesitation, and the suggestion that the machinery of death had already gone too far. That sequence revealed the true logic of the terror at its most advanced stage. Once virtue is claimed as a monopoly, disagreement no longer appears as argument. It appears as infection. The regime was no longer merely destroying enemies. It was erasing rival futures. Robespierre's fall on 9 Thermidor, Year 2, AD 1794, has often been described as the moment France recovered its senses. That reading is too charitable. The deputies who moved against him were not conducting a serene rescue of liberty. They were acting under the same revolutionary instincts that had governed the previous year. Preempt before being preempted, accuse before being accused, strike before the tribunal turns in a new direction. Robespierre and his allies were arrested, briefly aided by the Paris Commune, then overwhelmed and sent to the guillotine. The man who had helped make suspicion into a method was destroyed by men who had learned that method well. Thermidor was not the end of revolutionary coercion. It was a transfer of it. What followed proved the point. The Thermidorian reaction weakened the Jacobin apparatus, curtailed the committees, and stripped the language of civic virtue of its sacred aura. Yet France did not enter reconciliation. It entered retaliation. In parts of the South especially, the White Terror targeted former Jacobins, militants, and those associated with the politics of year 2. The direction of fear changed. The structure of fear did not. A revolution that has taught its factions to regard annihilation as legitimate politics cannot simply command moderation by decree. Violence, once moralized, outlives the faction that first sanctified it. The Constitution of AD 1795 tried to design against that danger. The Directory was constructed to prevent both monarchy and a new concentrated terror. 5 directors would share executive authority. 2 legislative chambers would slow decision-making. Power would be divided, filtered, and made deliberately less dramatic. On paper, it looked prudent. In practice, it created a republic too cautious to inspire confidence and too insecure to tolerate uncertainty. The Directory never fully trusted popular sovereignty, yet it could not rule without invoking it. So it relied on the methods it claimed to restrain. Administration was manipulated. Opposition was monitored. Elections were accepted when convenient and corrected when alarming. The coup of Fructidor in AD 1797, aimed at suppressing royalist gains, exposed the reality with unusual clarity. Ballots were valid only when they endorsed the regime's definition of necessity. That necessity rested on fragility. Economic instability continued to poison public life. Inflation, scarcity, speculation, and the long shadow of the assignat crisis corroded faith in Republican competence. Corruption widened the distance between revolutionary rhetoric and lived experience. Procurement, patronage, and enrichment flourished in a government that spoke the language of civic order while surviving through improvised advantage. War deepened the contradiction. It burdened the state, but it also kept the state alive. A weak regime often fears peace almost as much as defeat, because war supplies urgency, excuses failure, and turns criticism into suspected disloyalty. The Directory required victories not only for France's borders, but for its own credibility. The deeper social question had not disappeared with Robespierre. It had merely lost its Jacobin vocabulary. Babeuf's conspiracy of equals in AD 1796 made that unmistakable. Babeuf and his allies pressed beyond constitutional rearrangement toward a more radical social equality. One that challenged property itself and suggested that political revolution without economic transformation was incomplete. The conspiracy was crushed and Babeuf was executed, but the episode mattered because it showed that Thermidor had solved nothing fundamental. The anti-terror reaction had overthrown one form of extremity without curing the hunger, inequality, and frustrated expectation that had nourished extremity from the beginning. In that atmosphere, the army rose above its formal role and became the one institution that looked disciplined, meritocratic, and effective. Civilian politics appeared compromised. The military appeared decisive. That is the setting in which Bonaparte became more than a talented general. His Italian campaign of AD 1796 to AD 1797 delivered victories, indemnities, treaties, and prestige on a scale the Directory itself could not manufacture. But battlefield success was only part of the story. Bonaparte understood that modern authority required narrative command. Through bulletins, proclamations, and carefully shaped legend, he presented himself not simply as a servant of the Republic, but as its most competent embodiment. The Egyptian expedition in AD 1798 revealed the limits beneath the aura. Strategically, it was compromised from the start, and Nelson's destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile exposed how vulnerable the enterprise really was. Yet even this could be converted into political capital. Bonaparte returned to France not as a ruined adventurer, but as a figure who still seemed larger than the men governing Paris. By AD 1799, that imbalance had become decisive. The Directory had lost authority without losing its appetite for control. It had normalized intervention, emergency habits, and dependence on force, but it had not produced legitimacy. The coup of 18 Brumaire transferred revolutionary legitimacy into executive dictatorship with barely a convincing republican disguise. Bonaparte did not arrive from outside to cancel the revolution. He inherited its centralization, its administrative ambition, and its habit of saving politics by narrowing it. Then he placed all of it under command. The guillotine had become less visible, but the state itself had become harder, colder, and more obedient to executive will. The question waiting beyond that transformation was no longer who had triumphed in the latest factional struggle, but what remained of the promises that had set the entire upheaval in motion. Bonaparte stepped into a country that had not merely overthrown a dynasty. It had rewritten the terms of public life. The most immediate and undeniable achievement of the revolution was the destruction of hereditary privilege as a legal system. The August decrees of AD 1789 opened that breach, but the real transformation unfolded across the decade as aristocratic tax exemptions were stripped away, feudal dues were dismantled, and formal legal equality for male citizens moved from explosive rhetoric toward institutional fact. Birth did not vanish as an advantage, but it no longer held the same uncontested monopoly over office, promotion, and honor. Military service, education, administrative skill, and political usefulness now mattered in ways the Bourbon order had resisted for generations. France was reorganized into departments, overlapping jurisdictions were cut back, and the old vocabulary of subjects yielding obedience to a crown gave way to citizens claiming a place within the nation. Even when elections were narrow, manipulated, or unstable, the principle itself had changed. Power now required some language of public legitimacy. That was a revolution of enormous consequence. But it arrived joined to another revolution no less important: the expansion of state reach. The same decade that weakened seigneurial authority also normalized requisition, surveillance, censorship, and emergency decrees. Civil war in the Vade, mass executions, political purges, and the destruction of opponents under the language of necessity revealed the price of this new order. Assignat inflation corroded confidence and social trust. Public life grew harsher, more suspicious, more ideological. This was the first major paradox of the revolution. It liberated millions from inherited hierarchy while binding them more tightly to political power organized in the nation's name. It opened careers and narrowed dissent. It proclaimed rights and taught governments how easily rights could be suspended when fear was given administrative form. Hereditary inequality fell faster than durable liberty was secured. The exclusions were not an accident at the margins. They were part of the operating logic of the settlement. Women had helped drive events from the streets of Paris to the world of pamphlets, salons, and political agitation, yet the language of citizenship contracted when the question became actual power. Olympe de Gouges exposed that contradiction in her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen in AD 1791 with devastating precision. If rights were universal, then their confinement to men was not a minor oversight. It was a betrayal hidden inside the rhetoric of liberation itself. Her execution in AD 1793 was more than a personal tragedy. It showed how revolutionary regimes often react when their own principles are taken more seriously than their leaders intended. Universal language can be celebrated in abstraction and punished in application. The colonial sphere made the contradiction even harder to disguise. The convention abolished slavery in AD 1794, and on paper that was one of the boldest acts of the age. Yet the decision was inseparable from war, slave revolt, and the strategic crisis of Saint-Domingue. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people forced revolutionary France to confront what its own declarations would mean if applied beyond Europe. When Napoleon restored slavery in AD 1802, the limits of metropolitan universalism were exposed with brutal clarity. Principle bent before empire, commerce, and racial hierarchy. Haitian independence in AD 1804 therefore stands as both fulfillment and indictment. The most uncompromising defense of the revolution's universal claims emerged not in Paris, but in a colony France tried to subdue by force. Under Napoleon, the revolution's midterm legacy hardened into institutions. The Civil Code of AD 1804 preserved legal equality for men, property rights, and the secular authority of the state, while also reinforcing patriarchy and domestic hierarchy. Prefects extended central control into the provinces with a consistency the old monarchy had never fully achieved. The Bank of France centralized education, the Concordat with the papacy standardized administration, and the metric system all pointed in the same direction. France became more governable, more legible, more taxable, and more mobilizable. This was not the death of the revolution. It was its discipline. Yet discipline came fused with censorship, police surveillance, and warfare on a continental scale. Liberty survived, but administration became the true giant of the age. That is why the long-term consequences spread far beyond France. The revolution helped define the modern political citizen, but it also helped define the modern state that would classify, educate, conscript, and emotionally mobilize that citizen. Nationalism gained a new force. Mass conscription became thinkable on a new scale. The left-right spectrum entered political vocabulary and endured because the conflict beneath it endured. The upheavals of AD 1830 and AD 1848 inherited more than slogans. They inherited methods, expectations, and a model of politics in which legitimacy flows through the people yet can be organized, directed, and monopolized by disciplined minorities. What remained after the smoke was neither pure emancipation nor simple fraud. The revolution broke feudal hierarchy more decisively than it built freedom, and in doing so it created two of the modern world's most powerful figures at once: the citizen and the state that would forever claim to act in that citizen's name. The judgment, then, is severe precisely because anything gentler would be dishonest. The French Revolution was not a fraud wrapped in noble language, and it was not a pure dawn later spoiled by a handful of villains. It was liberation and concentration advancing together. It destroyed an old order that had taught Europe to treat privilege as natural, hierarchy as permanent, and inherited power as morally self-justifying. After AD 1789, Feudal superiority and dynastic absolutism could still survive in practice, but they could no longer survive with the same innocence. Their spell was broken. That was not a small achievement. It was one of the great ruptures in political history. Yet revolutions do not merely tear down. They redesign the field on which power moves. The same upheaval that shattered the old cage also revealed how much stronger government could become when it claimed to rule in the name of a moral people rather than a royal bloodline. Under the Bourbons, sovereignty was embodied in a king. During the Revolution, sovereignty migrated into the nation's name. That shift carried genuine emancipation. It also introduced a new danger. The nation is larger than a monarch, more sacred in rhetoric, and far more flexible in the hands of ambitious men. Once the people becomes the supreme source of legitimacy, the central political struggle becomes a battle over who may define that people, who may speak for it, and who may be denounced as its enemy. That is the deeper line connecting AD 1789, AD 1793, and AD 1799. The assembly declared that authority rose from the nation. The terror claimed that only extraordinary coercion could save that nation. Bonaparte then demonstrated that an armed executive could inherit the same revolutionary legitimacy while draining away unstable pluralism. Monarchy, assembly, terror, and empire were not isolated accidents scattered across a turbulent decade. They were stages in one transformation. Legitimacy passed from sacred dynasty to mass politics, and from mass politics to centralized command. The costume changed. The logic of concentration endured. This is why any honest verdict must resist both romance and cynicism. Admirers are right that the revolution enlarged the horizon of equality, citizenship, and secular public life. Cynics are right that it also trained modern power in surveillance, mobilization, suspicion, and ideological discipline. The rights of man were real. So was the law of suspects. Legal equality mattered. So did conscription, censorship, and emergency rule. The ideals were not false. That would be too easy. The more unsettling truth is that ideals, when fused to fear and stripped of restraint, do not soften the contest for power. They sanctify it. That is the most enduring lesson. When institutions lose legitimacy, moderation becomes structurally weak. Prudence begins to look like betrayal. Procedural limits begin to look like luxury. The factions that prevail are often not the wisest, but the most disciplined, the most morally certain, and the most capable of joining belief to organization and organization to force. The revolution exposed a pattern that the modern world would repeat again and again. Rights language, emergency language, and national language can coexist inside the same regime. A state can promise liberation while expanding coercive capacity. It can praise the citizen while building the administrative tools to register, tax, educate, conscript, supervise, and direct that citizen more deeply than earlier monarchies ever could. That is why the French Revolution still feels close. Modern politics rarely speaks in the old language of naked hierarchy. It speaks in the grammar forged after AD 1789. Citizenship, sovereignty from below, moral legitimacy, public virtue, collective danger, national salvation. Even governments that betray liberty prefer to do so in liberty's vocabulary. Even concentrations of power present themselves as guardians of emancipation. The grammar survived because the revolution permanently changed not only who could rule, but what every ruler had to claim. So the final verdict is neither sentimental nor dismissive. France did not merely exchange one tyranny for another, nor was the bloodshed a simple toll on the road to progress. The harsher conclusion is that emancipation and concentration were born in the same convulsion. The revolution made the citizen larger, and the state larger with it. It broke the cage. It built the machine. And the oldest political question returned in a more dangerous form. If every order invokes justice, if every faction claims the people, if every emergency demands exceptional power, then the decisive test is never the beauty of a society's ideals alone. It is whether those ideals are bound by institutions strong enough to survive fear, victory, and righteousness itself. That is the legacy that refused to remain in 18th century France. It entered the bloodstream of modern political life. The machine did not arrive speaking the language of kings. It arrived speaking the language of the people. If this analysis sharpened the meaning of the revolution, continue with the video on the end screen because it carries the same argument into another decisive struggle over power and legitimacy. Subscribe for historical analysis that does not stop at events, but explains the machinery beneath them. And one question deserves an answer in the comments. Which mattered more in the long run, the destruction of inherited privilege, or the rise of the modern centralized state?